Good evening, everyone. My name's Erin Bartram. I'm the school programs coordinator here at the Mark Twain House and Museum, and I'm delighted to be hosting tonight's program. We're so glad that you could join us. Tonight, we're welcoming Kim Kelly and Godfrey L. Simmons Jr. for a discussion of Kim's new book, Fight Like Hell, The Untold History of American Labor. Before I introduce our guests more fully, I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for this event on behalf of the museum. Our virtual public programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away in 2020. We here at the museum are happy to honor his memory with these programs, which we know he would have loved so much. We're also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting tonight's programs and all our other virtual programs. Now, one of the benefits of this being a virtual program is that you, the audience, can have your own conversation in the chat alongside our guests' discussion, and we do encourage you to do so. We'll also be posting the link, we maybe already have posted the link, to purchase a signed copy of Fight Like Hell from the Mark Twain store. Purchasing the book through our store not only gets you a signed copy, but also benefits the work we do here at the museum. As we go along, if you have a specific question for either Kim or Godfrey, you can post in the Ask a Question section. It should be to the left of the chat, right under the green bar at the bottom of your screen. While we're on the topic of the green bar, if you're enjoying the program this evening and want to make a donation to help us do more events like this in the future, you can go right ahead and give it a click to support our public programs. Every dollar the museum receives will be put to good use, bringing you more author events like this, as well as a host of other events, both virtual and in person. Tonight, your donations will be split between the museum and the HartBeat Ensemble, and you'll learn why in just a moment. Now that we've taken care of that and everyone's all settled in, let me tell you a bit more about our guests for the evening. Our moderator tonight is Godfrey L. Simmons Jr., Artistic Director of Hartford's HartBeat Ensemble. He is an award-winning actor, producer, director, and playwright who has spent 30 years amplifying the voices of marginalized people and communities. In 2012, he co-founded Civic Ensemble, a regional theater in Ithaca, New York. He was a producing artist for Off-Broadway's Epic Theater Ensemble for 4 years, appearing in a dozen productions. He's a lifetime member of Ensemble Studio Theater and sits on the board of the network of Ensemble Theaters. He's joined tonight by Kim Kelly. Kim is an independent journalist, author, and organizer. She has been a regular labor columnist for Teen Vogue since 2018, and her writing on labor, class, politics, and culture has appeared in The New Republic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Baffler, The Nation, The Columbia Journalism Review, and Esquire, among many others. Kim's also worked as a video correspondent for More Perfect Union, The Real News Network, and Means TV. Previously, she was the heavy metal editor at Noisey, Vice's music vertical, and was an original member of the Vice Union. A third-generation union member, she is a member of the Industrial Workers of the World's Freelance Journalists Union, as well as a member and elected councilperson for the Writers Guild of America East. So everyone, please give a warm welcome to Kim and Godfrey. I'm going to sit back and enjoy the conversation. I'll be back for the Q&A, so don't forget to post questions under Ask a Question. And Godfrey, just let me know when we're ready to move on to that part of the program.
Awesome. Hello. How's it going, Kim?
Good to see you. Excited for our chat. Thanks everyone for showing up.
Yeah, exactly. I switched just for transparency's sake. I just switched up things in my location and my kind of freak out about internet. Am I close enough to the interwebs? Am I close enough to all that stuff? So that's what happens. This is how you're thinking when you get to your 50s. Congratulations on the book. And it just came out, right? I mean, literally, I got an advance copy, but
yeah, last week, and
it's beautiful.
Looks like this.
Yeah,
my big baby.
Yeah,
yeah, it came out last Tuesday, and today's Thursday, so it's still pretty fresh.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's exciting to think about And it's daunting to kind of like undertake this story of labor in the United States. And it's been done before. It's not like it kind of like hasn't been thought of. But your lens is very particular. You have a very particular lens through which you're looking at it. I wonder, because you talk about it at the beginning of the book about kind of like growing up in like a union family, right? Yeah. How did that kind of impact the writing of this, or your decision to kind of go down this path?
Sure. It's funny because I am third generation union. Like my dad and my uncles are all construction workers. My granddad's a steel worker, grandma's a teacher. Like it's very like I joke that, you talk about blue collar. No one in my family has ever worn a collar in their life. And then there's me. I spent most of my life in the music industry as a journalist and promoter and touring person. Like I've only ever been to Connecticut on tour. So it's funny to be revisiting in this context.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I grew up knowing that the union had our back. Like union health insurance is the reason my mom's alive today. My dad's union paycheck kept us going. I remember him complaining about long, boring union meetings and, having to go on strike. And it was just sort of part of the background. That was just part of his job. It didn't seem like anything political or anything out of the ordinary. Like, oh, of course my dad's in a union. But it was only until I got older and joined a union myself that I realized that, oh, not everyone has that experience. Hell, not even everyone knows what a union is. That was something I experienced when I was at Vice, when we first started organizing. It wasn't that my coworkers were opposed to unions or had strong opinions. A lot of them didn't know what they were and didn't understand how that could be applied to the work we were doing, which was like working in digital media in the early 2010s. And once we got over that hurdle, we explained, oh no, you count too. Like there is a union for us. It's this union, the Writers Guild of America East. Like they want us, we count. And that kind of opened the floodgates for a lot of digital media organizing. And it also inspired me to kind of shift my focus from writing about heavy metal, which had been my whole life, which is why I look like this, to writing more about labor. And I'd always wanted to write a book. Of course, every writer wants to write a book, but I always thought my first book would be about music, not about, radical labor history. But here we are. It's funny how these things work out.
Well, and there's so much. I mean, labor is so much the inspiration for so much music. So there's it makes sense, actually. It's not right. Like it feels like there's so much music, and I'm thinking just, in terms of just like, I think about like my ancestors and just everything. There's so much about labor, about work, right? In terms of just like going back to, if you're descendant from any kind of, enslaved peoples, or if you're, descended from, or even like folks back, like, in the motherland in Africa, like work and song and music, that's in there, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you kind of bring a little bit of that musicality into the piece, which is cool. Talk to me about, because you said this thing about that they didn't know about unions, and that's interesting to me, because I'm wondering is that, and I should preface this, I'm in a union, I'm an actor, right? And so I've been in actors. Yes, I got exactly. So, that whole thing. My dad was in the military. There's no union in the military.
Yeah, there's laws against that, which doesn't seem fair, but
yeah. But what's interesting is that the military as a whole is such an ecosystem that can look out for its workers in a different kind of a way, because it's so structured. It's like the union thing is kind of built in a weird way, right?
It's a collective thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Us, not me.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like, it's a weird thing, because when people think of the military, they think bad things, and I think often, and it's just like, well, that's interesting, but how could they not know? That's really interesting. Is that about age, like that, or is it just about like, oh, more people just don't know, like through the years people just don't get that?
Yeah, and I mean, where I was working was in Brooklyn, 2014 to 2019. a bunch of, college educated younger people from like NYU, whatever, maybe grew up in the suburbs.
Right.
A lot of my coworkers had a very different class background than I do. And that's something that became really apparent really quick, especially around, the 2016 election, when I remember people were running all these stories about like Trump voters and all these, gritty photo essays of people that just look like my family. I was like, oh, okay, so there's definitely a little bit of a divide here. And a lot of them didn't grow up in union families or with, families that do blue collar manufacturing or heavy labor work. And I think there is this kind of perception, not even just in that specific situation, but kind of just in general in this country, that there's like a specific sort of person who is a union worker, and that unions are for certain types of workers. Like they're for coal miners and factory workers and folks who do heavy labor. They're not for grad students or strippers or booksellers, but like they are. And it's all one labor movement. We're all part of the working class. Sort of fueling those divisions doesn't help anybody but the bosses. But there is this perception that unions are kind of this relic of the 1930s, that people aren't interested in them anymore. And that's just not true. But that's what I encountered in that specific milieu. And hopefully it's something that's changing now. Yeah, grad student unions, the UAW, United Auto Workers, this stored industrial union, they're up to a quarter of their membership are graduate students now, or education workers. And
Really?
that's incredible. Yeah, I think they have like 400,000 members. 100,000 of them work in education. And I think that's so wonderful, because it shows that the union is evolving and growing with work. Like as work evolves, that union is trying to keep up. And that's what we need. We can't just stick to this old idea of like the white guy in a hard hat, because he's still here, he's still important, but he's not the only story that matters.
And I want to get to that. So, I mean, I don't know. You brought it up. Let's go there. He's in the book, so. But it's because that story. What's interesting about the book is that you and some of it has been done before, but you kind of put it all in one thing where you're demystifying some of these stories. The story about what the labor movement like is, or like kind of like what represents it. At the end, you talked about the I think it was a coal mine strike in Alabama.
Yeah, what's going on right now?
Yeah, in kind of like, and I liked how you kind of like frame it with like two things that are happening in 2021. The book. Both in Alabama, interestingly enough, one Amazon, and and so the whole modern thing, you said, like, why didn't it get traction? And, there are obvious reasons why it wouldn't get traction in, Republican, certainly media. I like how you kind of went like, the progressives aren't feeling them either, because when they think coal mine, they just think like a bunch of like white folks who are like conservative and everything like that. That like, you know what I'm saying? And
yeah, you're saying the kind of people that stand behind Trump for a photo op.
Supposedly, yes, exactly. That's what yes, that's the word you used. And so, talk to me about what your book is doing in that realm in terms of just looking at what work is and who represents the labor movement. Because when we say working class and politically, we know what that means.
Yes.
Right.
It's kind of a dog whistle at this point, isn't it?
Yeah. So what is it?
Right. Like, the working class is a lot more complicated than people in charge like to pretend it is when it's convenient for them. And I mean, even if we think about the picture of a union member in America, if you threw a dart and hit a union member in America, most likely it's going to be a Black woman who works in healthcare or in domestic service. Like, that's who a union worker is. That's who it always has been. It's always been people of color and women and disabled folks and queer folks. Sorry. Folks whose labor has been criminalized, folks whose existence has been criminalized. The rest of us has always been here. And sometimes whether we want it to be or not, right? Like, the history of this country is so complicated and it's so diverse and it's so rich. The fact that, the first factory strike in America was led by young women in Pawtucket, Rhode Island in like 1824. Young women workers kind of uh, elsewhere, like a few decades later, kind of pioneered the picket line as we know it. Like so many advances that were made because people that had nothing else going for them, that were being repressed and discriminated against and told that they weren't worth anything, stood up and said, well, you know what? Like, who are you to tell me that? There's more of us than there are of you. We're going to do something about it. Sorry.
No worries. No worries. Yes, water is good.
Powering through.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and so and then now kind of like and now there was kind of I think recently there was like some controtemps around the book looking at race in terms of just the Washington Post kind of mucked up this whole
Oh boy.
like your kind of attribution thing. But what I thought it brought up some interesting kind of like interrogations about who tells the story and all of that, and you had something interesting in terms of just like the title of the book. I wonder if you could talk about that, because I didn't, of course I knew that because I worked in publishing very briefly, but like I knew that this could happen. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's the Washington Post. And apparently this is a common thing that newspapers do, which I didn't know that because it's my first book. I'm a baby. And essentially, the Washington Post ran excerpts from my book and they edited it down. And in that editing, they cut out some really important citations from a very important scholar whose work that was a huge source for that specific section. And of course she was upset. Of course people are upset because that's awful. Like that is the worst thing you can do, to not attribute where your sources are and who already did that work and whose labor that you were building off of. And it was a lot of people got really upset, and I understand why. I do wish it had been more aimed at the Washington Post than me, but so it goes, like it happened. And I learned a lot about the differences between like academic publishing and trade publishing and journalism and how we all intersect. And there was a lot of criticism I saw of the subtitle of the book, The Untold History of American Labor. And when I was going into it, like when we decided on the subtitle, which, not to throw my publishers under the bus, but they very strongly recommended that we go with that subtitle instead of my original one. I originally wanted to call it A People's History of Labor in the U.S., because I think that was a little closer to my goal and kind of put it a little bit more in conversation with these radical histories that I was drawing inspiration from. But untold histories and hidden histories and secret histories, like that's a marketing tool and they sell apparently. And that's where we ended up. I didn't feel that bad about it because there is a really important labor history book called Labor's Untold History. And I was like, oh, that's kind of fun. Okay. And then it was later when I heard other folks talking about why that was problematic. I was like, oh man, I should have stuck with the original title. But now I know. And it's important to emphasize, like these stories, they've never been untold. Like the workers told them, and then archivists and contemporary journalists like preserved them, and then historians and academics unearthed them and saved them. And then journalists like me came in and built on that research and pulled all these threads together and synthesized it and offered it up to you guys to be like, hey, look at all this cool stuff that we found. And that's why the bibliography is like 48 pages.
Yeah, dude, that's a bibliography for your ass right there.
Yeah, because you have to cite your sources. You have to say this is where it came from. Yeah. Shout out to the people that put this legwork in first. It was such a bummer that all that kind of happened because I worked so hard to like cite and give credit where credit was due, because I know it's important. But at least now I know for the next book, maybe I won't call the Washington Post.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, it also gets it like the rigor that we have to have when we're kind of going on these, through these endeavors, particularly when you're creating art, the rigor that you have to have, it just never stops, right? Running a theater company, we're right across the street from the Mark Twain house. And so we have a new play that's running right now called Bee Trapped Inside the Window, which has a lot actually to do with labor and work. It's about domestic servitude and and like and women and isolation, and so it's really it's a fascinating play, and come see it, folks. We're closed this weekend, but more importantly, though, it you know, but there's a certain amount of rigor, just like running an organization. It is like doing this kind of like art, because there's an Asian American character in there, right? There's a Russian character in there. There's a a half Russian, half African child in there, right? Like there are all of these rigors, and it's written by a Romanian writer. The rigor that you just continue to have to kind of like deal with around gender and around race and around all of the things it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop after you publish it, produce, and figure it, right?
And there's so much, and I feel like the more you care, the more pressure you put on yourself to meet that. Like I was lucky my editor is a Black man, so I had at least that lens when it came through editing. Thank God for that. And then also for some of the chapters, I hired sensitivity readers. For the
Talk
sex
to me
work.
about that. I just heard about that. I just saw that written somewhere. Maybe it's in your book. Maybe I saw it in your book. But
I did thank them.
Yeah.
Yeah, but for like two specific chapters that I wanted to make sure I got right, the chapter on sex work and then the chapter on incarcerated workers, because those aren't experiences that I've had, but I love a lot of people who are in those communities and have been in those situations. So I was like, okay, it's important to me to bring these workers into this conversation, and it's important to do it right, because like the last thing you want to do is include people, but like speak for them instead of giving them that microphone. So so for the sex work chapter, I hired, like I paid a friend who's a sex worker, who's a queer Arab person, to read that chapter and let me know if anything stuck out to them. Like, is there anything here that doesn't sound right? Should I fix this? Just let me know. Does this ring true to you? And like I made a couple little changes. And of course, for that chapter, I only interviewed people who are current or former sex workers, because I think that's important too. For the chapter on incarcerated workers, same thing. I only spoke to people who are currently or formerly incarcerated or were abolitionists who are coming from that end of things. And my friend David was actually in Rikers while I was writing this book, and he helped organize a strike there in the earlier parts of the COVID pandemic, because him and the people in his dorm didn't have soap or a mask or anything that they needed. They were packed in like sardines. So he organized a strike with his I guess his coworkers. And he read through the chapter and gave me a couple little pointers too, because it's and it was just really, it meant a lot to me to try and get these things right, because like especially if these communities of workers have not been pulled into this conversation before in this way, like you got to do it right, or what's the point?
Yeah. No worries. No worries. I can fill up. I can bloviate for as long as we need to. I'm kidding. Although the people who know me probably would be like, yeah. But anyway, so, but, yeah, I'm, just to bring it home though, this came up, you know how people, in those talk shows, they say like, we're in the green room or whatever. Now we're kind of virtual. So in the virtual green room, someone was just like, hey, well, what's some stuff that happened in Connecticut, and like what kind of local kind of, things happen around labor. What I thought was interesting was that Erin said, she talked about like how it's just, people don't necessarily think of like labor when you think about Connecticut. Like you don't think Connecticut labor, in terms of just like, you know what I'm saying? I don't know, maybe, but it doesn't seem like.
It's not exactly Appalachia.
Right, exactly, right? So what, so there's some stuff that took place in Connecticut in terms of these stories, or?
Yeah, there's when that came up in the green room, I was racking my brains and I was like, I know there's some New England stuff at the very least, right. And I'm sure Connecticut has shown up. Yes. I'd have to get there's a lot in the book. In fairness, I wrote it like a year ago, but one thing that jumped to mind specifically, I was like, oh, P.T. Barnum, and I'm sure you're thinking, why? What does that have to do with labor? But there is a whole section in my chapter on disabled workers that deals with the sideshow. and with disabled performers specifically who worked in that space. And it's personal to me because I trained at the Coney Island Sideshow School. And as a disabled person in the sideshow, like that's a really interesting and complex history. And I mean, researching that was kind of one of the most fun aspects because it was, again, one of the things that you might not necessarily think would be in a labor book, but is part of labor history. And I love thinking about how one of those performers, Charlie Stratton, also known as General Tom Thumb, he made so much money on that circuit. He and his wife, Lavinia Warren, he bailed P.T. Barnum out of bankruptcy. Like, he was one of the cases where it worked out well for him. He made a lot of money. He had a very comfortable life. But there are also other performers, specifically performers of color, Black workers, specifically women, who had to deal with so many extra layers of like just racism and sexism and like exoticism, colonialism, all of these like fucked up isms kind of coalesced in this very specific space. Yeah. And while some disabled sideshow performers traveled the world and played for Queen Victoria, others were like basically held prisoner and treated like animals. One woman, an indigenous woman from Mexico, Julia Pastrana.
Oh my God. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
This is so disturbing.
Yeah, it's the worst one. If you're not familiar with her, she was like an accomplished dancer and a singer, an incredibly kind woman, very intelligent, but she happened to be covered with hair and have like a very distinctive appearance that led her to success in the sideshow. But she ended up being exploited and treated awfully. She married her manager. They had a child who had a similar condition to her. And when she died pretty young, that manager arranged for her to be taxidermied, would be the best word, and then displayed her and her son like on the sideshow around the country for decades. Like she got lost at one point. I think they found her in Norway. Like it was just the most inhumane possible treatment for a person's body. And she wasn't repatriated until like
you say what you want. You say you pronounce how you want to pronounce it.
Right. It took decades for this woman and her baby to go home. And like it's just stories like that within labor. Like she was a worker, she was an artist, and she was treated like an animal because of who she was and how she was born. And that's sort of an extreme case, but there are a whole lot of people throughout history who have had that, well, maybe they weren't taxidermied, but have had to deal with that kind of dehumanization on the job and just in larger society. So that's kind of a tenuous Connecticut connection, but I'm always glad to talk about my fellow sideshow freaks.
And so thinking about the different kind of stories that are in there, one of the interesting things you do talk about is you actually talk about some of the story, like some of the backstory about even finding out about the stories or the fact. I think it's with the when you talk about I think it's the section that really talks about queers in terms of just organizing, specifically how like that history would be buried if it weren't for like one person. And there's a bit of that in the book.
Yeah, if it weren't for there were so many like social historians and academics, like just sometimes it was one person who cared so much about one particular subject, one particular demographic. They kind of saved their stories from being lost. In the case in the Marine Cooks and Stewards Union,
right.
This incredible, oh my God, it was really this social historian named Alan Barabay who really preserved that history. And this was a union that they don't exist anymore. They kind of got red baited out of existence, like a lot of the coolest radical unions back in the day. But at one point, there was a very queer, very lefty, very militant, predominantly Black and later Asian union on the waterfront that got shit done. Like they were very proud of who they were. Like they held drag balls to raise money for union events. Like
when was this?
I'm trying to remember exactly when it was.
Like the 40s or something ridiculous?
It was a long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
I got to look it up. So there's this one person in particular, the Honolulu Queen, who, oh yeah, this was in, oh gosh, I can't remember the year. It's terrible.
Yeah,
I have to check.
but they were renovated, so it was before.
They
It
were red,
was,
but
it
yeah,
was
because a lot of them were
right,
communists, a lot of them were radicals, and they were
yeah.
also Black, and they were also queer, and they were not apologizing about any of that.
Yeah, I
And
remember
that,
listening to it. I remember like listening to it and then like reading it and thinking, wait a minute, wait.
oh, uh-oh. Did I freeze or did you freeze? Shoot. Oh no, I feel like he's saying something really cool. Shoot. Oh no, he looks very serious too. I wonder if we should. Oh. Okay. Oh no, it's just me now. Hopefully he'll make, yeah, virtual programming. Hopefully he'll be back in a minute because I really want to know what he was going to say. And, you know, since we're here, I can find that exact date for you talking about the Marine cooks and stewards because it's such an interesting history. And it took, like, I found them in, well, I didn't find them. I came across that story in a book that was about something completely different, just about just like queer, like a queer social history of the West Coast. And they popped up and I was like, what? There's this whole union. Why don't I know about this? Why doesn't everyone know about this? This is really cool. And that was unfortunately the case for so many really radical, really militant unions, especially in the 30s, really the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and also the early 1900s. Really kind of always. Any union that's gotten a little too radical has been a little too threatening to the powers that be or too powerful to the agents of capitalism. Someone's found a way to drag them down. But the Marine cooks and stewards, they were hanging out in the 1930s. Oh, there he is. I was just doing story time waiting for
Yes,
you.
I love it. It was great.
Oh, can you hear me?
I actually heard a bunch of what you said. So
Oh. See, I can keep going too. We're
that's
good.
awesome. I love it. It was great. But I love that it was like you were going down another path, which, you know, yeah, I was a journalist back in the day, and you know, I love when it happens where you just kind of, right?
One little thing I would do when I was doing research, because I have so many books, and I would be reading about something completely different, but then I would go to the back and look at the index and see if there's anything about unions or strikes or anything that sounded labory. And then if I found something, I would go back and then I would follow those threads somewhere else. Because like I don't have access to a lot of academic material because I'm not an academic, but so I kind of had to improvise a little bit, like go through old newspapers, old magazine articles, like newspapers.com, like that was such a huge help, like especially for finding quotes from people, like contemporary. Okay. Yeah, like one of my favorite people in the book, Ida Mae Stoll, this female coal miner from the 1930s in Ohio. Someone did a profile on her when she was much older, and she had so many quotes. She was like, she could definitely kick my ass and probably yours too. Like she was tough. And she had just all these incredible quotes that just showed how furious she was that at one point in the 30s, she was kicked out of her job and told to go back to the kitchen. And she fought that. She got her job back. And she paved the way for generations of other women to enter the coal mines. But she was like, just some of the way she phrased things, it was just like, I can't believe anyone tried to mess with her in the first place.
I'm curious about how much you were able to do, because so many of the people are gone, or I'm sure you probably had like virtual interviews or like on the phone or like whatever. Maybe they like just emailed. This is an interesting question, and I'm really curious about this. What would you say was your most kind of impactful in-person kind of interaction? I mean, I was going to say interview, but it's not just about that, because you're not just interviewing, you're like experiencing things, you're like living, you're breathing it, right?
Yeah, in terms of in person, it would have to be my folks in Alabama, you know, the
Mm.
Amazon workers, and then the UMWA coal miners. Like those are, it's kind of funny. Like I spent the whole year and change writing this book either in this little room in South Philadelphia or in Alabama. I didn't go anywhere else. I didn't even see my parents. But I just couldn't. I don't know. There's something about the folks in Amazon and the mines that just really held me, and I couldn't give up on their stories. So they were the people I talked to the most about these things and got to know the most. And it was, you know, when I initially set out to write this, my thought was like, oh, I'm going to fly everywhere. I'm going to sit down with everyone. I'm going to go to archives. I'm going to go to libraries. I wasn't going anywhere except Alabama. And I mean, one of the people that I was really thrilled I got to interview was a woman named Carol Lay, who used to go by the name the Scarlet Harlot. And she is this incredibly impactful, like lifelong sex worker activist out in the Bay. Like she was around in the 70s, like out there getting shit done. And she's still deeply involved in that community. And now she's, you know, she's a little older. She's dealing with cancer. Like she's still tough as anything, but I really felt honored that she took the time to speak with me. We talked for like an hour on Zoom. She shared a lot of really interesting insights. And I feel like that's the kind of thing this kind of experience that you hold close when you're doing this kind of research, because, I mean, God willing, she'll outlive all of us. But in case she doesn't, I'm really glad I was able to hear from her, like, as close to in person as possible about her experience and about the intersections of sex work and labor. And just, yeah, hear her tell it, because it's her story, right?
Yeah. 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 Are you still there?
Me?
Yes. Am I frozen?
Oh, I'm here. But you don't look
Yeah.
frozen.
I'm not frozen? Okay, great, good.
No.
You're frozen on my end, but like I
Oh,
want to
no.
make sure. Oh no, I'm like nuts, man. My internet. I told you. Anyway, so but your voice is awesome, so I'll keep going. Uh, and then in a few minutes we'll kind of move to some I think questions from the audience, but I love what you said about just hearing from people who you know, those stories might go, right? Those people might actually leave us. One of the things that was, I did a production of Grapes of Wrath, and I happened to be fortunate enough to play Tom Joad. And the Grapes of Wrath is this great, it's a lovely book about workers and about the depression and the fallout, you know, in the Dust Bowl by John Steinbeck, as I'm sure many folks on this who are tuning in here probably know. But playing Little Tom Joad had such echoes and connections to me because I'm the child of a sharecropper, and so. And I don't know where I'm going with this, but there's something about, there feels like something larger about work and about what it means to like to be in a situation where you've got to just keep going. You have to keep going. You have to keep working, and somebody above you is going to be either cracking the whip or trying to keep you down or choosing you. You know, my grandfather was one of those people who was, yeah, my grandfather was one of those people you would be on the street corner in North Carolina, and they would be like, okay, you, and you. And then they'd go and like share crop or work at the sawmill or whatever, you know?
Right. My granddad's family, they were tenant farmers in New Jersey, just moving around and working on other people's land in the Depression. So it's like, yeah, just having that. And then our jobs are way different from their jobs, but we're still connected to that legacy. We're still part of that grand story of labor, even if it looks a little bit different. And their struggle and their sacrifice is what has led to our existence. And hopefully what we do now will help other people after us, right? Like it's all connected. It's all a big chain.
Yeah. Yeah. And the divide, do you, and this is my last kind of question before we kind of go to things, to the audience questions. Do we just chalk this? Do we just chalk up? Do we just chalk this up to greed instead of just like corporate greed? Is that it?
It's capitalism.
Is it just capitalism? Like, is it that simple? Like, is it that is it? You know,
It shouldn't be, but I mean, even just greed, because I mean, there's so many lessons throughout the examples throughout history of people in power, people with money, people in charge, having the opportunity to do the right thing and then just deciding, no, I might make a little bit more money if I do this. Like, example that comes to mind, think about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, right? This incredibly important, pivotal moment in labor history that didn't need to happen. The reason it happened was because the owners of that factory locked the doors. And so when a fire broke out amidst the scraps and the dust, the poor ventilation, nobody could get out. The people died in the elevators. People jumped out onto the concrete. Like it didn't need to happen. And the reason that they locked those doors is because they didn't want the workers to take any fabric scraps home. Because God forbid they take a penny's worth of cotton to make some socks for their baby or something. And even before that, and this is, there's such a connection there that maybe isn't always as explicit, but 2 years prior to that, 1909, the uprising of the 20,000, which was a massive strike of garment workers, predominantly women and girls, because kids worked then too, predominantly Eastern European Jews and Italian women. They hit the streets, they shut down the city, and they got most of the major garment factories to sign on, to recognize their union, to sign on to, better working conditions. But one of the only outliers was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And then 2 years later, this is what happened. And if those bosses had just signed the contract, had let the union in, had stopped locking the doors, had given up maybe a couple dollars total a year, 146 people wouldn't have died that day. And it's just, maybe it is just human greed. Maybe it's whatever scarcity mindset and just sort of brutality that living under capitalism breeds in people. But it's kind of depressing to think about, like, how little workers' lives are worth to the people who are in charge. But that's why we need to keep in mind that we are all we have. And when together we're powerful, together we can win. We've done it before. We'll do it again. You've got to look at it that way, because otherwise, if you lose hope, you don't got nothing.
Right.
And we can't give up. Like, we can't let the bastards win. So it all comes down to building collective power and looking out for one another, because we're really all we got.
Yeah. Aaron, shall we go to some questions?
Oh, I see one.
Hi. Yes. All right. Well, we got one question in that's excellent. I'm going to ask my one seed question that I had just in case, so other folks can think of things as we go. One thing at the house, when I work with children, we always talk about who lived and worked in this home. And one of the things that people want to know about the most are the people who worked there. So we know the names of some of the staff. We know the name of the coachman. We know the name of the lady's maid. We know the butler. We know that the butler was raised in slavery and liberated himself and becomes a butler in one of the most prominent houses in New England. But often we struggle to give specifics about the lives of people who work in domestic service. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about how their stories are in this book and how their stories are part of the labor movement.
Yeah, I have to give so much credit to the academics and historians who know how to find these things and can comb through those archives and do everything they've done to pull those voices out, because I don't know how to do that. So thank God for them, because that's such difficult work, right? Because so many people, especially if they weren't encouraged to learn how to read or write, or just didn't have time to write out a diary and didn't have anywhere safe to put it, like that kind of worker's life is just, those folks are made to feel like they don't matter while they're alive. So why would anyone try to preserve their legacies after they're gone? And I'm just so glad that I was able to find some evidence of that and some accounts of that, thanks to those historians. But yeah, it's not funny. It's an example of history rhyming in that domestic workers then and domestic workers now have to deal with some of the same things, like a lot of the same things. I mean, even going back to one of the most important labor laws in the country, the National Labor Relations Act, 1935, there were several groups that were carved out explicitly. Independent contractors like yours truly, and more importantly, agricultural workers and domestic workers. And that happened because at that time, domestic workers were predominantly Black women, agricultural workers were predominantly Black men. And Southern lawmakers who needed, they needed their votes in Congress to pass this law. They insisted that those workers get carved out because they didn't want them to organize. They didn't want to give them any power. And that law is still like our major law. Like domestic workers still don't have that right enshrined the way that so many other workers do. And thank God that domestic workers have taken matters into their own hands and organized themselves throughout the centuries. I mean, even in Philly, I think it was a couple of years ago, the city council passed this really, really strong legislation, the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, that kind of tried to rectify some of that and like helped domestic workers get health care and help them organize, like gave back a little bit of what was taken from them. But that's just one city. I think of in Atlanta in the 60s, Dorothy Lee Bolden, she made history about organizing the National Domestic Workers Union of America. I think at its peak, she organized about 10,000 members. And to join, you had to show up with $1 and a voter registration. Multiple ways of building power there. And there's a lot of examples of that throughout history, throughout the book. I have a whole section, a whole chapter on what I call the cleaners, people whose job it is to clean up other people's messes and the ways that manifests. But yeah, there's a lot of history there. And I'm so glad that so many workers throughout history have organized and taken power back in spite of every possible obstacle. And I'm so glad that some people have been able to unearth their stories and their voices so that, little magpies like me can show up and try to share them with everybody else.
Yeah. Who else is in the cleaners chapter? Can you give us a teaser of who else gets categorized that way?
Well, since I do have the book right here, I tried to mix it up a little bit and keep things a little bit surprising and keep things not vague, but kind of all encompassing. I've got talking about workers in the power laundries, Dorothy Lee Bolden, Latina janitors in California. I wrote about Marvel Cook, this pioneering Black journalist in Harlem, who wrote about the Black domestic workers during the Depression, who would, like Jeffrey was saying about his father, they would wait on the street corners and wait to be hired by a white woman who would pay them a couple pennies a day. And I also talk a little bit about the Wages for Housework campaign and the idea of women's work and reproductive labor and all of these different ways that certain types of people have been expected to clean up other people's shit throughout the centuries. So there's a lot in there. I tried to weave things together in a way that made sense to me, at least.
Awesome. All right. So someone mentioned I started a job as a social media specialist at a university here in Denver. In my 8 short months, we've had 9 people leave the department. I've talked to some folks about unionizing, and we might have a shot, I think. What is the toughest part about trying to organize a workplace in your experience, and any tips you wish you knew during your time at Vice?
Don't let the boss know what you're up to. So don't talk about it on Slack or on like public communications, but talk to your coworkers in empty rooms, or, well, given that we're still in the pandemic, hit up, like, make signal threads, make a Discord, have old-fashioned phone trees. Talking to your coworkers is the most important thing, because if you're passionate about joining a union, other folks will probably be passionate too once they understand why. That was something I came up against at Vice. It wasn't that people were against it. It was like they didn't understand how a union applied to them. And thankfully, like now, 7 years later, there are so many examples of workers in the digital media space, in the education space, in the nonprofit space, who have unionized and won. Like, you have a lot of precedents to draw on and to point to. You can say, like, look at what UAW is doing. Look at what OPIU is doing. Look at what folks in digital media are doing. Like, pretty much for any type of work you're doing, there's a union that you can find a way into, or that would be excited to talk to you. It really just comes down to talking to your coworkers and being able to counter their fears, because this stuff is scary. You know, a lot of people think, oh, we're not allowed to talk about unions. We're not allowed to talk about our wages. Like, can we get fired if we talk about this? You can, but that's illegal. So you do have rights. Like, you do have rights here. You're allowed to do this. Like, even the current president keeps saying, like, he wants more people unionized. Like, well, there you go. Like, if that guy's into it, your boss can suck it up. It's a little flippant, but honestly, the most important thing is talking to your coworkers and not dismissing their concerns, even if to you they might seem silly or counterproductive. Like, taking a minute to understand where people are coming from and why they might be opposed, why they might be afraid, and then talking through it with them and showing them that you value their opinion, even if you think you have a different perspective. Like, that's how you build a strong union. You don't want to make anyone feel like they're being pulled along before the ride. You want everyone to feel empowered and valued, and want everyone to feel like it's their union too. So even if it takes a little bit longer, making sure you build those real connections with people, that's how you're going to win.
Yeah, we are the union is the thing, that it's not the external, it's the internal.
It's not some dude showing up and like telling you what to do. Like, it's literally what you want.
Yeah. Well, and to get a little more into the weeds, someone mentions or makes the argument, worker cooperatives and collectives are how we get free. How do we push institutional unions in that direction? So I guess there's really a question about the different approaches you can take to building labor power.
I like that. Love a co-op. Love work. I mean, I'm politically speaking, I'm with you. Yeah, it's interesting because like covering unions and being involved with unions and being unions for a while, it is so interesting seeing how different they all are. Like, some of them are super progressive. Some of them would probably read that and be like, yeah, that's a great idea. And some of them would probably think that we're raving loonies that want to, destroy the world with our liberal agenda. So it's kind of a tough question. Like, how do you move a movement? But honestly, there's nothing stopping workers from going that way on their own and forming their own unions. Like, a union doesn't have to go through the NLRB. It doesn't have to be recognized by the government or even by the boss. Like, the IWW has been out here since 1905, operating on the basis of solidarity unionism, like building up enough power on the shop floor where the boss is too scared to push back. Like, that is a valid option. And I'm a wobbly, so I have a big soft spot for that side of things, especially because like people think that the IWW like doesn't exist anymore, which is very rude because they do, and they are making moves, especially on the West Coast, and organizing in fast food and other industries. Like, there are so many different ways to be a union and so many different ways to build power. Like, you don't have to be in a union at all. Like, starting a worker co-op, working with a worker center, like there's a lot of different ways to build power, right? Like, there's no one way to swing a cat and no one way to get to the revolution. And I don't know how we get traditional labor unions to become more interested in the worker co-op model, but I bet there are a whole lot of individual workers who would be interested in that. And so maybe starting on a smaller scale is the way to go, because you got to start somewhere, and you may as well start with building up an example, right? To show, hey, this works, this is great. Why don't you guys try this too?
I know there's several bookstores that have done that co-op model. Bookstores.
Yeah, in Philly we have the Wooden Shoe that's all volunteer run. I think there are a handful at the very least of like radical bookstores who follow that that model, and it's like, yeah, sometimes it works, and that's great. Like, we need more options, not less.
Yeah.
Do you think
that's one? Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Godfrey.
No. Go. The only follow-up I was just going to ask is, do you think that the things are going better for like labor as a movement? Do you think is the growth that seems to be happening, Amazon, Starbucks, and with some of the smaller entities, is that real? Does that growth feel real?
I hope so. I think the optimism and the energy is real.
Yeah.
And I really hope that leads to improving some of the other things we're dealing with, like the fact that I think union density is down to 10.3% in the country, which is abysmal. Terrible state of affairs. But hopefully, this enthusiasm and this public interest around unions, these big bombastic wins we're seeing, especially the fact they're being led by the younger generation, by Black and brown workers, by queer and trans workers. Like, I think there's a whole younger generation who are seeing themselves in the labor movement in a way that maybe they hadn't before, when all you would see is like an occasional press release from a white guy in a suit. Like, you know, bless their hearts, but again, they're not the whole story. And I think that recent events have shown people like, oh, there's a place for you in this movement too. Like, that's what I tried to do with the book, so that anybody could pick it up and find a reflection of themselves within the pages. Because we are so much bigger and so much more powerful than we think. And hopefully, you know, we're getting to a point where we'll be able to flex some of those muscles.
Well, I wanted to ask sort of, and to emphasize, if a lot of these terms are new to you, those of you who are joining us tonight, one thing that I think Kim's book shows is like there isn't a single concept of even a union, like that the difference between the IWW and the AFL-CIO and all of these things are historically contingent and have changed because of a lot of interesting reasons. And it's one reason to take a look at this. And notwithstanding the challenges of the subtitle, Kim, I'm going to ask you one question. In a sentence, what is the untold history of the labor movement?
We have always been here.
Nailed it.
That's what I want to say. That's what I want people to know. Whoever you are, this is your movement too.
Wonderful. And it was a terrible thing to ask her to do that in one sentence, and she really did a good job with it. So I appreciate it.
I a lot of union meetings. I love a slogan.
Excellent.
And she's a writer, so that's her job, right? That's your work. Yeah. Right. So yeah, that's great.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and thanks to Godfrey and Kim for taking this time with us. If you joined us late or you want to go back and rewatch the program, you're in luck. All of our virtual author programs are posted on our website and available for you to watch whenever you'd like. Just give this one a little time to process. We have great virtual and in-person programs every week, so make sure to check the museum's event page to see what we have coming up. Or visit us here at the house. I mean, not here at the house, this is my house, but here at the Mark Twain House where we all work. We're open 7 days a week. It's a beautiful time to visit. Come learn about who lived and worked in our workplace. We'd love to see you there. So thanks again to both our guests for the night, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thanks, Kim. So great. Thank you so much. This is a great talk.
I'll have to come up and visit you guys when it's a little safer.
Absolutely.
When I get my voice back, maybe.
Exactly. Take care of yourself.
Thank you all so much.